It started like any other Friday night. My parents had left for the weekend to visit some relatives in the next town over, leaving me alone in the house. At 23, I didn't mind. I actually enjoyed the solitude. With the house to myself, I decided to shoot some hoops in the backyard before calling it a night. The cool air felt refreshing as I dribbled the ball across the small concrete court. Our house wasn't anything fancy. 2 stories, white paint chipping off in places, and a backyard that felt secluded thanks to the tall wooden fence. It was quiet except for the rhythmic thud of the basketball hitting the ground. That's when I saw her. I paused mid-dribble, the ball rolling lazily away. Looking up, I saw a woman standing at the upstairs window of my parents' bedroom. She wasn't someone I recognized. Her pale face was framed by long, unkempt hair, and her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore straight into me. She didn't move. Just stood there, watching. My chest tightened. My first thought was that I was imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or I was just tired. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Someone was in the house. Dropping the basketball, I sprinted inside, heart pounding in my ears. Every step echoed through the empty halls as I raced up the stairs, flipping on lights as I went. I threw open the door to my parents' room, expecting to find her there, but it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the window locked from the inside. I searched every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone. After checking the locks on all the windows and doors, I sat on the couch in the living room, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the shadows played tricks on me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, something didn't feel right. By the time I climbed into bed that night, I was still uneasy. I kept the lamp on and the bedroom door slightly ajar, listening for any unusual sounds. Minutes turned into hours, and eventually, my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was drifting off, I felt it. A faint, rhythmic vibration. It wasn't the kind of jolt you'd feel in an earthquake. It was subtler, almost like someone was shifting their weight at the foot of the bed. My eyes snapped open, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming, but when I leaned up on my elbows, I saw it. A hand? It was pale and bony, gripping the edge of the mattress. Then a face appeared, her face. The woman from the window. She was crawling out from under my bed, her wild hair falling across her face as she locked eyes with me. I froze. My body refused to move as fear flooded my veins. She moved slowly, deliberately, her cracked lips curling into a twisted smile. Then, instinct took over. I screamed, throwing myself off the other side of the bed. She lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge her outstretched arms. "Get away from me!" I shouted, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from my nightstand. I swung it wildly, and to my shock, she barely flinched. Her strength was unnatural for someone her size. She grabbed at my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and I could feel the raw power in her grip. I fought back with everything I had, yelling as loud as I could, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. The commotion must have caught the attention of my neighbor, Mr. Connolly, because moments later, I heard his voice calling from outside. "Ethan? Are you okay? Help!" I shouted, still wrestling with the woman. She tried to pull me down, but I managed to break free and bolt for the door. I threw it open just as Mr. Connolly came rushing in. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, his eyes widening when he saw the woman staggering after me. Together, we managed to pin her down. She thrashed and screamed, her strength almost too much for the two of us to handle, but we held on until the police arrived. The officers burst in, pulling her off of us and handcuffing her as she continued to scream incoherently. Later, the police told me that the woman was a known drug addict with a history of breaking into homes. She'd been living on the streets for years, slipping into empty houses and staying hidden for days at a time. They found her belongings stashed in our attic, a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a knife. The thought of her lurking above me while I went about my days sent shivers down my spine. The officers commended me for my quick thinking, but I didn't feel brave. I felt lucky. Lucky that I'd noticed her at the window, lucky that Mr. Connolly had come to help, and lucky to be alive. That night changed me. Even now, months later, I still double-check every lock before going to bed, and the faintest noise makes my heart race. Sometimes, I catch myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see her staring back at me. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, that hollow, unrelenting stare. It's a reminder that sometimes, the things that scare us the most aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people. And they can be just as terrifying. My name is Jason Miller. I'm 17, and I live with my parents in a house at the edge of a forest in rural Pennsylvania. It's quiet here, almost too quiet. I've always hated how isolated it feels, especially at night when the trees seem to breathe, creak, and whisper secrets I'm not supposed to hear. Last month, my parents went on a week-long business trip, leaving me alone for the first time. At first, I thought it would be cool, no curfews, no one nagging me to do chores. But by the third night, the silence felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath. That evening, it was cooler than usual. I grabbed my earbuds, stepped outside, and let the crisp air wrap around me. The backyard was dimly lit by a single yellow bulb over the porch, its light barely stretching to the edge of the trees. Beyond that, everything was shadow. I scrolled through my playlist, trying to decide on a song, when I heard it. Help Me! It was faint, almost drowned out by the rustle of leaves in the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then it came again. Help me! A man's voice, hoarse and weak, coming from the forest. I froze, earbuds still in my hand. My first thought was that someone was hurt. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost or injured. But something about it didn't sit right. The tone was wrong. Desperate, but not in the way you'd expect from someone truly in need. It was too deliberate, like whoever it was knew I was there and wanted me to hear. Who's there? I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. For a few moments, I stood there, straining to hear anything else. But the woods were silent again, save for the occasional chirp of a cricket. My heart was pounding, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal. I turned to go back inside. Help me! This time, it was louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced toward the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. I couldn't be sure, but it felt like someone was there, watching me. I backed up onto the porch and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket, considering calling the police. But what would I say? I heard a creepy voice in the woods. They'd think I was some kid playing a prank. For the next few minutes, I paced around the living room, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I even opened the door a crack and peeked outside. The yard was empty. The trees swayed lazily in the breeze. I told myself I was imagining things and turned off the porch light, plunging the backyard into darkness. Big mistake. A minute later, as I stood by the window, I heard something, footsteps. Soft but deliberate, crunching on the gravel path near the side of the house. I froze, staring out into the pitch-black yard. My pulse was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. Then I saw him. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint moonlight near the pool. He was tall, lanky, and wearing tattered clothes that hung off his frame like rags. His face. I'll never forget his face. His mouth was twisted into a wide grin, but his eyes were wild, unblinking. He stood there for a moment, staring at the house, before tilting his head back and laughing, a loud, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back from the window, my heart in my throat. He must have seen me, because his laughter stopped abruptly, and he walked straight up to the glass. "Help me," he whispered, his voice muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Then he slammed his fist against the window, I screamed. "Get away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm calling the cops!" That seemed to work. His grin faltered, and he backed away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he'd appeared. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but my finger hovered over the call button. What if he was gone by the time they got here? What if they thought I was lying or overreacting? Instead, I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking each one twice. Then I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other, waiting for any sign of him coming back. The hours crawled by, and I didn't hear another sound. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep. That morning, I went outside to check the yard. The gravel path was undisturbed, and there were no footprints near the pool. It was as if he'd never been there. I told myself it had to be some kind of sick prank or a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? That a strange man had appeared, laughed at me, and vanished without a trace? They'd probably think I was crazy. For the rest of the week, I kept all the lights on at night and slept with the knife under my pillow. Thankfully, I didn't see or hear anything else. When my parents came home, I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't want to scare them or make them think I couldn't handle being on my own. That night started out so quiet. My parents had to rush my older brother to the hospital after he fell from his bike and hit his head. The doctors wanted to keep him overnight, so they called me from the hospital and told me they wouldn't be back until morning. I didn't mind. I was 10, but I liked having the house to myself. I grabbed a blanket, some snacks, and parked myself on the couch in the living room, watching cartoons until my eyes started getting heavy. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me. The TV was still on, filling the room with a dim, flickering light. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like someone had pressed down on the front porch. My heart skipped. It could have been the wind, I thought, or maybe a raccoon. But then, the front door opened. I froze. My parents had locked it before they left. I was sure of it. The door didn't just swing open by itself. Someone had to have turned the knob. I didn't move a muscle, barely even breathed, as three shadows slipped into the house. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but the glow from the TV showed enough to make my stomach churn. There were three of them, 2 men and 1 woman. One of the men was tall, muscular, with a shaved head and a tattoo crawling up his neck. The other was skinnier, wiry, with shifty eyes that darted around the room. The woman was short, wearing a heavy jacket, and carried a large duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The bag looked empty, at least for now. They moved quickly, scanning the living room like they were looking for something specific. The wiry man whispered something to the others, and they nodded before splitting up. The tall man stayed in the living room, opening drawers and rifling through shelves. The woman headed toward the kitchen, and the wiry man, he started down the hallway. Toward me. I snapped out of my trance and scrambled silently off the couch. My room was just down the hall, the second door on the left. I knew I couldn't outrun them, and I definitely couldn't fight them. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran into my room, closed the door as softly as I could, and crawled into the closet. The closet was small, just a narrow space with a row of clothes and a few boxes shoved in the corners. I pushed myself into the darkest corner, behind a stack of old winter coats, and pulled my knees to my chest. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. The floor creaked under each step as the wiry man moved closer. I could hear him breathing, low and steady, as he pushed open the door to my room. I held my breath. The sound of drawers opening and closing filled the room. He was searching for something, though I had no idea what. Then, the closet door creaked open. I bit down on my lips so hard I thought I might draw blood. The coats swayed as he pushed them aside, and I could feel his presence, his shadow stretching over me. My fingers dug into my knees, and I prayed he wouldn't see me. Then, just as suddenly as he'd opened the door, he stopped. His footsteps retreated, and the closet door clicked shut. I waited, frozen, until I heard his voice echoing faintly down the hall. "Nothing in there. Let's check the other rooms." For what felt like an eternity, I stayed curled up in that corner, listening as they tore through the house. They opened drawers, dumped out cabinets, even pulled paintings off the walls. Every now and then I heard one of them mutter something to the others. "Jewelry box in the master bedroom." Or, "Check the safe." I couldn't tell how much time passed. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes before I heard the tall man call out, "We've got enough. Let's go." Their footsteps moved toward the front door, and I heard it open and shut again. I didn't move for a long time. Even after I was sure they were gone, I stayed in the closet, listening to the silence, waiting for any hint that they might come back. When I finally crawled out, the house felt different, emptier, colder. I walked through the wreckage, my hands shaking. Drawers were left open, their contents dumped onto the floor. My mom's jewelry box was gone, and so was the family safe from the closet in my parents' room. Even the TV remote was missing. But they hadn't taken everything. My brother's favorite baseball cap was still hanging on the coat rack, and the little ceramic dog my mom loved was still sitting on the mantel. They'd taken what they came for and left the rest. When my parents got home the next morning, I told them everything. My dad's face went pale, and my mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. They called the police, and I had to tell the story all over again. The officers were kind, but their faces were grim as they walked through the house, taking pictures and writing notes. One of them knelt down next to me and said, "You did the right thing by hiding. That was very brave." Brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt lucky. The police never found the burglars. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without a light on. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. It took a long time for our house to feel like home again. My name's Jack, I'm 30, and I live in this small, cozy house in upstate New York. It's one of those mother-daughter houses, 2 separate apartments stacked on top of each other but connected. I've got the upper floor. The lower one belongs to my sister, Abby. She's 26, works as a nurse, and is usually out late or at her boyfriend's place. That night was like any other. It was a Friday, and I'd decided to treat myself to some bad decisions, a greasy pizza, a 6-pack of beer, and a horror movie marathon. I love scaring myself, even if I know I'll regret it later when I can't sleep. By the time the second movie rolled around, I was starting to feel the buzz from the beer and the creeping unease from the jump scares. It was perfect. By 12:30 a.m. I was done. The last movie had left me on edge, but I was tired enough to brush it off. After locking up and turning off the lights, I crawled into bed. The heater hummed softly, and the wind outside rattled the windows, just another cold November night. That's when I heard it. "Jack!" It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. My eyes shot open, and I stared at the ceiling. "Jack!" This time, it was clearer. It wasn't just a voice, it was Abby's voice. I sat up, my heart thudding. Abby wasn't supposed to be home. She texted me earlier, saying she was staying at her boyfriend's place overnight. Still, I figured maybe she'd come home early and forgotten to tell me. Groggy and a little annoyed, I swung my legs over the bed and grabbed my phone. No missed calls, no texts. "Jack, come down here!" Her voice was calm but insistent. It echoed faintly from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment before heading down. The staircase creaked under my weight, the sound louder than usual in the quiet house. When I reached the bottom, I flicked on the light. "Abby?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The living room was empty. The kitchen was dark. Everything looked exactly as it should, quiet, still, normal. "Abby?" I tried again, stepping into her apartment. The air felt colder down there, like someone had left a window open. I checked the locks. Everything was secure. Her bedroom door was ajar, just enough for me to see the neatly made bed and the stack of folded laundry she'd left behind. No one was there. I was starting to feel stupid. Maybe I'd imagined it. Too many beers, too many horror movies, my mind playing tricks on me. I turned to head back upstairs when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't her voice. It was a sound, a faint clattering, like something being knocked over in the living room. My stomach tightened. I froze at the base of the stairs, listening. It came again, louder. I grabbed a broom from the corner. Pathetic, I know, but it was better than nothing, and crept toward the living room. The light flickered for a moment as I stepped inside. Nothing. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. The TV remote was on the coffee table, the books were still stacked neatly on the shelf, and the windows were locked tight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence was suffocating. I stood there for a few minutes, my ears straining for any sign of movement. When nothing happened, I finally let out a shaky laugh. I was being ridiculous. I went back upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and climbed into bed. I checked my phone again, still no word from Abby. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little creak and groan of the house felt amplified, like the walls themselves were alive. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was 8 a.m., and Abby was calling. "Hey," I said, my voice groggy. "Were you home last night?" "What?" "No," she replied. "I told you, I was at Dylan's." "You're sure?" "Yes, Jack." "Why?" I didn't know how to answer that. Instead, I mumbled something about thinking I'd heard her and hung up. She got home a couple of hours later, cheerful and oblivious. When I told her what happened, she laughed it off, saying I'd probably scared myself after watching all those movies. She was probably right. But I couldn't shake the feeling. For days afterward, I kept replaying that night in my head. The voice, the noises, the cold emptiness of her apartment, it all felt too real. Too deliberate. And then there was the way she said my name. It wasn't just a call, it was a command. Even now, I can't explain it. I've tried convincing myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by too much beer and too little sleep. My name is Evan, and I was 14 at the time. It was a Friday night, and my parents had gone to a fancy party downtown. They trusted me enough to leave me home alone, which was fine by me. I was looking forward to a quiet night, maybe watching movies or playing some games. Around 7 p.m., my friend Danny came over for a bit. We hung out, played video games, and ate way too many snacks. Danny left around 9 p.m., just as the last bit of daylight faded. I walked him to the door, made some joke about how dark it was outside, and locked the door behind him. Everything seemed normal, quiet, calm, and uneventful. But that changed quickly. About 15 minutes later, I heard a faint noise from the backyard. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. We lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, and it wasn't unusual for critters to wander around. I tried to ignore it, but the sound came again. It wasn't random like you'd expect from an animal. It was deliberate, like footsteps crunching on gravel. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went to the living room and peeked through the blinds that overlooked the backyard. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was a man sitting on the old wooden chair in the middle of our backyard. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, facing the house. The dim light from the kitchen window barely illuminated him, but I could see enough. He was wearing a dark coat, and his hair looked messy, like he hadn't combed it in weeks. But it was his face that sent chills through me. His eyes were locked on the window, on me. And he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but something else. It was wide, forced, and twisted, like he was trying too hard. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was a prank. Maybe Danny had decided to mess with me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized this man was older, taller, and definitely not Danny. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. For a while, I just stood there, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Should I yell at him? I didn't want to make a scene if this was some weird misunderstanding. But then he moved. Slowly, the man stood up. His movements were deliberate, almost unnatural. He walked to the back door and tried the handle. The sound of it rattling sent a jolt through me. Thank God it was locked. I had checked all the doors earlier, just like my mom always told me to. But hearing him actually try to get in made me feel like the locks weren't enough. I crept to the hallway and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I thought about calling the police, but something held me back. What if he saw me on the phone? What if that made him angrier or more determined? I didn't want to do anything that might provoke him. Instead, I crouched behind the kitchen counter, trying to stay out of sight. For a moment, everything went silent. I thought maybe he had given up and left. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps moving around the side of the house. My blood ran cold. He was heading for the front door. I crawled toward the front window and peeked out from behind the curtain. There he was, standing on the porch, staring at the door. He leaned in close, like he was trying to see through the peephole. Then he tried the handle. Again, it was locked, but the way he jiggled it made it sound like it might break. Panic set in. I backed away from the window and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. What if he found another way in? What if he broke a window? I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed, though I had no idea what I'd do with it if he actually got inside. I sat there, holding my breath, listening. The house was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came the sound of the back door rattling again, harder this time. He must have circled back around. Each rattle sent a wave of fear through me. It wasn't just the fact that he was trying to get in, it was the persistence. He wasn't giving up. And then, silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No footsteps, no rattling, nothing. I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly. Minutes passed. Maybe even an hour. I checked the time on my phone, but I don't remember what it said. All I could think about was whether he was still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek out the window again. The backyard was empty. The chair he had been sitting on was still there, but the man was gone. I didn't see him anywhere. I waited a little longer, just to be sure, but he never came back. When my parents finally got home, it was almost midnight. My mom could tell something was wrong right away. I told them everything, about the man, the smiling, the rattling doors. My mom was furious that I hadn't called the police, but my dad seemed more concerned with checking the locks and making sure the house was secure. They reassured me that I did the right thing by staying inside and keeping quiet, but I could tell they were shaken too. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted. The police came the next day and said there were no signs of a break-in. They told us to call them if it ever happened again, but it didn't. I'll never know what could have happened if those doors hadn't been locked.